The telegram arrived on a Tuesday in March, and within 48 hours the entire household knew. Charles Whitmore Ashford III had a daughter, not the abstract memory of a daughter, a real one, present, verifiable, standing in the parlor of his Wilmington mansion with her hands folded and her eyes wet with 30 years of longing. The family lawyer was summoned. Documents were produced. A birth certificate, faded but official, emerged from a leather portfolio. The handwriting matched the archives. The dates aligned. The woman, she introduced herself as Eleanor Margot Ashford, though the family had known her by different names in whispered conversations during her absence, produced letters, photographs, a locket containing her father's image from before he'd gone silver at the temples. The grief that had calcified in Charles's chest over 3 decades began to crack, and something like joy, or perhaps the memory of joy, started to pour through the fissures. No one questioned it, not at first. Why would they? Charles had lost Eleanor to scarlet fever in 1891, or so the death certificate claimed. The small coffin had been lowered into the ground on a November afternoon that no one in the family had ever fully recovered from. Charles had commissioned a marble angel to stand sentinel over the grave, spending money with the ferocity of a man purchasing absolution. The other children, Margaret, Henry, and Robert, had grown up understanding that their sister's absence was the wound their father would carry to his own death. And now, impossibly, the wound was closing. A woman had walked through the front door, and she was every version of Eleanor that Charles's memory had preserved. She was his daughter. The question that would take months to surface and years to fully articulate, was never asked in those first weeks. No one asked, how does a child die and then return? No one examined the documentary evidence with the skepticism that a family of considerable means ought to have deployed. No one consulted the doctor who had attended the funeral, or the priest who had spoken the words of committal, or the gravedigger who had filled the hole. Instead, the family fell into a narrative so compelling, so desperately needed, that the machinery of critical thinking simply shut down. Charles wept. He held his daughter's hand. He instructed his lawyer to begin revising his will. Eleanor, or the woman calling herself Eleanor, moved into the east wing of the mansion, and the household reorganized itself around the gravitational pull of her presence. She was accomplished in ways the family had not expected. She spoke French with an accent that sounded vaguely Parisian, though she explained she'd spent time in Montreal. She could discuss classical literature with an erudition that surprised Henry, the youngest son, who fancied himself an intellectual. She knew the history of the Ashford fortune in meticulous detail, the railroad investments, the industrial partnerships, the political connections that had accrued wealth across 3 generations. When asked how she knew these things, she offered explanations that were always just plausible enough. She'd read about the family over the years. She'd kept newspaper clippings. She'd constructed a genealogy of her own life, tracing herself backward through the branches of the family tree until the roots connected. The hunger to claim herself as Ashford had driven her to know everything about what she was claiming. And perhaps that was the first lie, or perhaps it was simply the deepest truth, that she had studied the family with the intensity of someone preparing for an examination that would determine the course of her entire life. She had learned not just facts, but textures, the way Charles took his coffee, the scar on Margaret's left hand from a childhood accident, the nickname that Robert's wife used when she wanted to be alone with her husband. She had researched not just the public record, but the private mythology of the family, the stories they told about themselves when the doors were closed and the servants had retired. And when she finally walked through that door in March 1921, she did not walk in as a stranger. She walked in as someone who had lived in the Ashford house for 30 years without ever being there, who had inhabited their memories and their conversations and their private selves with the precision of a ghost. The grief of Charles. This is the heart of what would later be examined, dissected, analyzed by the family's lawyers and eventually by the newspapers, and eventually by history itself. Charles had been waiting for this daughter to return. Not consciously, perhaps. Not in any way he would have admitted to himself. But the part of him that had buried a small coffin had never fully accepted that finality. Death, for the very wealthy, can sometimes feel like a negotiable circumstance. Money can purchase second chances, or at least the illusion of them. And so when a woman appeared at his door with the right accent, the right knowledge, the right ability to reference a moment from Eleanor's childhood that Charles had never told anyone, when she produced these proofs like a magician pulling doves from sleeves, something in him simply acquiesced. The desire to believe became indistinguishable from belief itself. The story she was telling him was not a new story. It was the continuation of a narrative he had been writing in his mind for 30 years. What no one could have anticipated, and what would only become clear much later when the investigation had begun, and the documents had been scrutinized, and the lies had been catalogued, was the sheer architectural precision of the deception. This was not a crime of opportunity or impulse. This was not a woman who had seen a lonely widower and decided to exploit him. This was something far more calculated, far more disturbing, and infinitely more human. This was a woman who had constructed an alternate identity so meticulously, so completely, that she had essentially willed herself into existence as Eleanor Ashford. She had become her own fabrication so thoroughly that even after the truth had been exposed, after the documents had been proven false and the story had collapsed like a house built on water, the question remained, who was she really? And more troublingly, who had she convinced herself that she was? The unraveling would come later. The lawyers would find discrepancies. The genealogists would discover gaps. The investigators would trace her real origins to a small town in Pennsylvania, to a mother who had worked as a seamstress, to a childhood of profound ordinariness. But in the moment of discovery, that moment when the facade cracked and the truth began to seep through, Charles Whitmore Ashford III would face a question far more unsettling than whether his daughter was real. He would face the question of whether his own need for her had been so powerful, so all-consuming, that it had fundamentally altered his ability to perceive reality. And he would have to live with the understanding that in a family of considerable intelligence and substantial resources, a woman had simply wished herself into their lives, and they had let her, not because they were foolish, but because, in their own way, they had needed her to be real far more than they needed the truth. To understand how Eleanor came to be Eleanor, it is necessary to understand who she was, before she decided that who she was would no longer suffice. Her birth name was Margaret Ellen Thorne. She was born in 1873 in a town called Carbondale, Pennsylvania, a place where the earth had been blackened by coal dust so thoroughly that even the sky seemed to wear the stain of it. Her mother, Sarah Catherine Brennan, had come to America from Cork in 1870, with little more than a willingness to work, and the kind of intelligence that manifests itself not in formal education, but in the ability to survive. She had married a man named Thomas Thorne, who worked in the mines for 7 years before the mines worked in him, and then he was gone. Not dead exactly, though the distinction became meaningless. He had simply walked away one winter morning, and Sarah never heard from him again. Margaret grew up in rooms above a tailor shop where her mother took in seamstress work. The apartment was always too cold in winter and too warm in summer, and it always smelled like the sizing that Sarah used to stiffen fabric. There was never much money, but there was something that money cannot easily purchase in a working-class household: time and attention. Sarah worked long hours, and Margaret grew up in a particular kind of loneliness that shapes certain personalities in specific ways. She became observant. She noticed how people moved through the world, what made them comfortable, what made them afraid. She listened to conversations and learned to detect the invisible threads that connected people to their circumstances. She understood, early, that identity was not something fixed at birth, but something that could be worn, adjusted, performed. The town itself was a place of radical transformation. Men arrived as farmers, miners, laborers, and within a generation, their children had become something else: accountants, shopkeepers, teachers. The American mythology of reinvention was not abstract to Margaret. It was textured, real, physically manifest in the lives of people around her. She saw people remake themselves through education, through strategic marriage, through the simple act of leaving one place and arriving in another. The message the world sent to her, repeatedly and consistently, was this: you are not fixed. You can become someone else. You can choose who you want to be. But Margaret was not born into circumstances that made reinvention easy. She was a girl with a poor mother and no father. She was intelligent but uneducated in any formal sense. She was attractive, but in a way that made men suspicious. They sensed something calculating in her, an assessment in her gaze that made them uncomfortable. She was, in short, precisely the sort of person that society was designed to keep in place. And perhaps that is when the obsession began, not with becoming Eleanor Ashford specifically, but with the idea that the life she had been assigned at birth was negotiable. She left Carbondale at 17, claiming to a friend that she was going to Philadelphia to work as a governess. The friend never heard from her again. In fact, Margaret had gone to Wilmington, Delaware. What possessed her to choose Wilmington specifically is a question that historians and psychologists would later debate at length. The most likely answer, according to the Pinkerton detectives who would eventually investigate her, is that she had read about the DuPont family in a newspaper. She had read about their fortunes, their mansions, their social dominance in Delaware, and she had read about Charles Whitmore Ashford III, a man connected to those circles through business and marriage, a man of substantial wealth, a man who had suffered the loss of a daughter named Eleanor. The specificity of this choice, that she would select not just a city but a family, not just a family but a man who had experienced precisely the loss that would make him vulnerable to her claim, suggests a mind that was capable of a particular kind of strategic thinking. For nearly 20 years, Margaret lived quietly in Wilmington. She was 37 years old when she walked into Charles Ashford's life. In those 2 decades, she had worked as a seamstress, a governess, a lady's companion. She had lived in boarding houses and rented rooms. She had read constantly, books on history, genealogy, biography, psychology. She had attended lectures and concerts. She had positioned herself at the edges of social gatherings where she could observe the wealthy, without being observed in return. And most importantly, she had studied the Ashford family. What becomes clear when examining the records that were later uncovered is that Margaret had spent years constructing an alternate genealogy, not fabricating documents, not yet, but rather learning the family's history so thoroughly that she could inhabit it. She knew about Charles's marriage to Margaret, also Margaret, the original Margaret, a woman from a prominent Philadelphia family. She knew about the children, Eleanor, Margaret, Henry, and Robert. She knew about Eleanor's death in 1891, not from public records but from years of careful research into newspaper archives, courthouse documents, society pages. She knew about Charles's grief, about his obsessive maintenance of Eleanor's memory, about the marble angel that stood in the cemetery like a sentinel guarding a wound. The question that would haunt everyone involved in her case was this: at what point did Margaret Thorne cross the line from historical research to criminal intent? Was there a moment when she decided that she would become Eleanor? Or had the decision been made so gradually, so incrementally, that even she could not have identified the turning point? The evidence suggests something more complex than simple calculation. It suggests a woman who had spent 20 years imagining herself into a different life, who had studied that life with such intensity that the boundary between fantasy and plan had become blurred, who had essentially conducted a very long, very thorough preparation for a transformation that had become, in her own mind, less a deception and more a correction. The first forged document appeared in late 1920. It was a letter, ostensibly written by a woman named Catherine Westmore, an English widow who claimed to have known Eleanor Ashford during her years abroad. The letter was warm, filled with personal details that seemed to confirm Eleanor's existence in Europe during the years when the family believed her to be dead. The handwriting was elegant, the paper was expensive, the seal was authentic. Charles received this letter through a circuitous route, a friend of a friend, and it moved him deeply. It seemed to confirm something he had always hoped, that Eleanor had not simply died but had somehow escaped, had found a life abroad, had survived. Margaret had forged the letter herself. She had taught herself handwriting analysis and forgery by studying other documents, by practicing obsessively, by understanding that the devil was not in the details, but in the texture of authenticity. She knew that Charles would want to believe, and that his desire to believe would do much of the work for her. What she was beginning to understand, as she moved toward the moment when she would finally present herself to him, was that the most effective deception is not one that deceives the intellect. It is one that seduces the emotion, that makes believing feel like a relief rather than a suspension of disbelief. By the time she appeared at Charles's door in March 1921, she had become Eleanor, not just in costume or manner, but in the very architecture of her consciousness. She had spent so many hours imagining Eleanor's life, inhabiting Eleanor's perspective, understanding Eleanor's pain and Eleanor's longing, that the line between who she was and who she was pretending to be had effectively dissolved. The woman who walked into the Ashford mansion was not Margaret Thorne performing a role. She was Margaret Thorne who had, through years of concentrated effort, become convinced that she was Eleanor Ashford, and perhaps that conviction was the most powerful tool she possessed, because when people encounter someone who believes absolutely in their own identity, it becomes extraordinarily difficult to disbelieve them. The tragedy of Margaret's story is that it was not born from pathology alone. It was born from the legitimate human desire to escape a life that felt predetermined, assigned, inescapable. It was born from the psychological reality that identity is far more fluid and constructed than we typically admit. It was born from the observation that the world is divided between those who are given permission to reinvent themselves and those who are not, and that permission is often simply a matter of having the right accent, the right background, the right access to the machinery of deception. Margaret had no such access, so she invented it. And in inventing it, she revealed something deeply uncomfortable about how identity works, about how vulnerable even the most rational people are to the stories they want to believe, about how thin the barrier is between legitimate reinvention and fraudulent deception. The first thing anyone noticed about the woman who appeared at Charles Ashford's mansion in March 1921 was that she looked like Eleanor. Not exactly. There were differences that a careful observer might have noted. The bone structure was subtly different. The eyes were a shade lighter than the family records described. But what Charles noticed, and what would continue to shape his perception in the months that followed, was not the differences, but the resemblances. She had Eleanor's hands, long-fingered, elegant, with a particular way of moving them when she spoke. She had Eleanor's posture, a kind of careful uprightness that suggested not stiffness, but awareness. She had Eleanor's voice, or at least a version of Eleanor's voice that Charles had been reconstructing in his memory for 30 years, and which this woman seemed to have studied with sufficient precision to invoke it almost perfectly. Physical resemblance, of course, is not proof of identity, but it is extraordinarily persuasive, particularly when the person being deceived is desperate to be convinced. Charles had spent 3 decades maintaining a mental image of his daughter. That image had been refined, edited, romanticized through years of grief and selective memory. The woman now before him did not have to match the real Eleanor. She only had to match the Eleanor that Charles had constructed in his mind. And in this, she was extraordinarily effective. She had not just researched Eleanor's appearance. She had studied photographs, consulted with relatives about childhood features, learned how the face might age. She had not just assumed Eleanor's voice. She had understood the psychology of accent and inflection well enough to produce something that felt authentic, even as it was entirely invented. The second element in the architecture of resemblance was behavioral. Eleanor had supposedly spent years abroad, primarily in France and England, with a year in Canada recovering from illness. The woman claiming to be Eleanor demonstrated linguistic facility in French that would have been remarkable if it had been studied rather than inhabited. She moved through rooms with the kind of graceful confidence that suggested years of exposure to European drawing rooms. She understood the social conventions of aristocratic life, not theoretically but practically, with the kind of knowledge that comes from lived experience rather than research. And yet, if one had examined her too closely, one might have noticed that her French was too perfect, not in the sense of being fluent, but in the sense of being rehearsed. Her knowledge of aristocratic life came not from memory, but from the kind of intensive study that leaves traces in its precision. What gave the deception its power, however, was something more psychological than visual or behavioral. It was the fact that the woman claiming to be Eleanor seemed to understand Charles in ways that only a daughter could have understood him. She knew about his fear of abandonment, which had been magnified by Eleanor's death and had shaped his relationships with his surviving children. She knew about his complex feelings regarding money and legacy, the way his wealth had become both a solution and a prison. She knew about the moments when he felt profoundly alone, even surrounded by family and servants and the accoutrements of a substantial life. When she spoke to him, she seemed to see into the deepest recesses of his psychology, and she reflected back to him the understanding he had been seeking for decades. How did she know these things? The answer, which would only become clear after the investigation, is that she had pieced together a psychological portrait of Charles Ashford through years of careful observation and research. She had read about him in newspapers. She had cultivated a distant cousin of the family, an elderly woman named Beatrice Ashford, over the course of several years, building trust through small kindnesses and strategic attention. She had listened to Beatrice talk about Charles with the kind of patient intensity that makes people eventually reveal their deepest secrets. She had, in other words, conducted an intelligence operation on Charles Ashford's psychology, compiling information about his vulnerabilities, his desires, his fears, his patterns of thought, until she could predict not just what he would say, but what he would feel. This is the aspect of the deception that most disturbed the psychologists and detectives who later studied the case. It was not the forged documents that revealed her psychological sophistication. It was not the false accent or the constructed identity. It was the fact that she had understood, on a deep level, what a particular man needed to believe in order for his worldview to be reassembled. She had studied him the way a hunter studies its prey, not out of malice necessarily, but with a kind of cold precision born from desperation. She needed to be believed, and she understood that the key to being believed was not to impose an identity on Charles, but to fulfill his deepest psychological needs. The victim's perspective in this moment is crucial to understand. Charles Ashford was not a foolish man. He was 73 years old, a veteran of substantial business dealings, a person accustomed to making judgments about other people's trustworthiness. And yet when this woman appeared before him, claiming to be his daughter, something in his rational architecture simply surrendered. It was not that he ceased to be intelligent. Rather, his intelligence became subordinate to his need. He wanted to believe so desperately that the possibility of disbelief never fully manifested in his consciousness. He was presented with a choice between two narratives, one in which his beloved daughter had somehow miraculously survived, and another in which an elaborate con was being perpetrated by a woman he had only just met. His mind did not weigh these possibilities against each other. Instead, it simply selected the narrative that caused less pain, that filled the void that had been carved into his psyche 30 years earlier. This phenomenon, the psychological preference for a beautiful lie over an ugly truth, is not unique to Charles Ashford. It is a universal aspect of human cognition, but what made Charles's particular vulnerability so pronounced was the specificity of his loss. He had not simply lost a daughter. He had lost a daughter at a moment in her life when her identity was still being formed. He had no adult memories of Eleanor to compare against. He had only the memory of a child, which had been gradually transformed by 30 years of grieving into something almost mythological. Any woman who was intelligent enough to avoid direct contradiction of his cherished memories could inhabit the space he had left vacant for her. The woman claiming to be Eleanor understood this with almost prescient clarity. She did not attempt to provide detailed memories of her childhood that might be contradicted. She provided instead a narrative of loss, abandonment, and eventual recovery that mirrored his own emotional journey. She told him that she had been taken by relatives when she was young, that she had been hidden away, that she had spent decades searching for a way home. She wove his own grief into her narrative, so that by listening to her tell her story, Charles was essentially listening to his own most profound desires given voice. She had not learned this technique from any book or any teacher. She had learned it from years of observing how people talk about their losses and understanding that what people need is not facts, but resonance, stories that echo their own internal mythology. One particularly revealing moment occurred in the second week of Eleanor's presence in the house. Charles had taken her to the cemetery to visit the grave that bore her name. The marble angel stood sentinel, exactly as it had for 3 decades, and Eleanor, or the woman calling herself Eleanor, approached it with an expression of profound emotion. She wept. She knelt before the grave. She placed her hand on the marble and seemed to be communing with something beneath the stone. And Charles, watching her, was convinced entirely, because what he was witnessing was not a woman performing grief. He was witnessing a woman grieving for herself, for the self she had been forced to leave behind, for the identity she could no longer claim, for the life that had been taken from her by circumstance and deception, and the simple cruelty of human fate. The architect of this deception had understood something fundamental about identity, that it is not something that exists independently of the way other people perceive it. Eleanor Ashford did not exist as an objective fact. She existed as a collection of perceptions, memories, stories, and beliefs held in the minds of other people. The woman claiming to be Eleanor had essentially become Eleanor by convincing the people who mattered most that she was Eleanor. And in doing so, she had exposed a profound truth, that identity itself is a form of deception that we all perpetrate on each other, and that the boundary between truth and fiction in how we understand ourselves is far more permeable than we would like to admit. Once Eleanor was integrated into the household, a curious phenomenon began to occur. The woman who had been Margaret Thorne, who had spent decades preparing to become Eleanor Ashford, essentially disappeared. Not physically. She moved through the mansion, she appeared at dinners, she maintained her persona with consistent precision. But psychologically, Margaret seemed to cease existing. The preparation had been so thorough, the research so exhaustive, that the act of inhabiting Eleanor required no conscious effort. It had become automatic, reflexive, as natural as breathing, and this transition, from performing a role to inhabiting it, is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of her psychological profile. The family in those early months began to reorganize itself around the presence of the returned daughter. Margaret, Charles's surviving daughter, the legitimate one, experienced a peculiar kind of displacement. She had been the primary female figure in her father's household for decades. She had managed his social calendar, advised him on business matters, served as the visible anchor of family identity, and now, suddenly, she was secondary. Eleanor commanded Charles's attention in ways that Margaret had never been able to, and the painful truth, one that Margaret would eventually articulate to the family lawyers, was that Charles seemed to love this new Eleanor more fully, more completely, than he had ever loved his actual daughter. Henry and Robert, the younger sons, experienced different forms of displacement. Henry was fascinated by Eleanor. He questioned her extensively about her years abroad, her experiences, her observations about the world beyond Wilmington. And Eleanor, the woman playing Eleanor, answered these questions with an almost encyclopedic knowledge that went far beyond what a person could have genuinely experienced. She seemed to have lived in every European city worth living in. She had read everything, seen everything, understood everything. Henry was seduced by her intellectual sophistication, never quite noticing that her sophistication was of a particular kind, not the intuitive understanding of someone who had actually lived an experience, but the articulate knowledge of someone who had researched it extensively. Robert, the youngest, was suspicious, not because he could identify anything definitively wrong with Eleanor's story, but because something in her manner struck him as performative. He noticed the careful precision with which she responded to questions. He observed the way she seemed to be continually assessing the emotional temperature of the room, adjusting her responses based on what the family seemed to need from her. He mentioned his suspicions to Henry, who dismissed them, and then to Margaret, who confirmed them but noted that their father seemed so happy that it seemed cruel to pursue the matter. This silence, this collective decision to suspend disbelief, would become the foundation on which the entire deception would rest. What is remarkable about the period from March to December 1921 is how rapidly Eleanor was woven into the family's identity narrative. Charles had her formally presented to society. The newspapers ran stories about the miraculous return of the Ashford daughter. Extended family members who had known the original Eleanor struggled to align their memories with this woman, but most ultimately accepted the narrative. The human tendency toward confirmation bias did much of the work. People remembered Eleanor the way Charles had described her to them for 30 years, through the lens of his romanticized grief. This woman matched that lens. Therefore, she must be Eleanor. The woman herself, Margaret or Eleanor, or whoever she had become by this point, seemed to be consolidating power within the household. She was extraordinarily attentive to Charles's needs. She positioned herself as his confidant, his advisor, the repository of his deepest thoughts and feelings. She learned his routines and inserted herself into them seamlessly. She became the person he consulted when he was having trouble sleeping, the person he wanted beside him at dinner, the person who understood him completely. And in doing this, she was not simply deceiving him. She was creating the psychological conditions under which his love for her would become profound and irreversible. This is a crucial distinction. The deception was not simply a matter of false identity. It was a matter of creating an emotional bond so strong that questioning it would have felt like a form of psychological self-destruction. If Charles admitted that Eleanor was not Eleanor, he would have to confront not just the fact that he had been deceived, but the fact that the love he felt for this woman, which had seemed to be a recovery of something lost, was actually the love of a phantom. The psychological cost of that realization would be immense. And so, at some level, Charles had a vested interest in not discovering the truth. The deception was not something that was done to him. It was something that he participated in, perhaps even required. The psychological literature on confidence games and long-term deceptions identifies a phenomenon called identity fusion. Over time, the deceiver's constructed identity becomes not simply a role they are playing, but an actual aspect of their personality. This woman, Margaret Thorne, Eleanor Ashford, or something in between, seemed to have experienced this process with unusual intensity. Her journals, which would later be discovered by investigators, contain passages in which she refers to herself as Eleanor without qualification. She describes her memories as Eleanor's memories. She discusses her childhood as if she had actually experienced it. At some point, the boundary between the real and the constructed had become so thoroughly blurred that it is genuinely unclear whether she was lying to the family or lying to herself. One passage from her journal, dated in November 1921, is particularly revealing. She wrote, "Today Charles told me he loved me, not as he has learned to love me since my return, but as he would have loved me had I never been taken from him. I wept, not because I was moved, but because I realized in that moment that I do not know if I am mourning the life I have lost or celebrating the life I have found. I am Eleanor now. I have become so thoroughly Eleanor that the woman I was before seems like a fever dream, a nightmare I have finally awakened from. But if I am Eleanor, then who is mourning? Who is celebrating? Who is remembering the woman I was? And does it matter?" This question, does it matter, seems to have become central to her psychology by the time she had been in the house for several months. She was beginning to experience a kind of dissociation, a sense that the boundary between truth and fiction had become meaningless. She was Eleanor. The document said so. The family believed so. Charles loved Eleanor. She had become the object of his love. Therefore, she was Eleanor. The logical conclusion felt airtight. And yet there was something else. A ghost of the original Margaret, watching from somewhere deep in her own consciousness, marveling at what she had constructed, and terrified of what would happen when the construction finally collapsed. The family experienced her as increasingly confident, increasingly assured in her place. She began to exert influence over Charles's business decisions. She positioned herself as the heir to family knowledge and family power. She learned the details of the estate, the structure of the will, the distribution of assets, and slowly, subtly, she began to reshape the family's financial future, not through theft, not through obvious manipulation, but through the simple exercise of the kind of influence that comes from being someone's beloved daughter. She would mention casually that she had always assumed the East Wing would eventually be hers. She would observe that it seemed strange that Margaret and Henry had equal shares when she, as the eldest, had been displaced by circumstances beyond her control. She would construct a narrative in which her eventual inheritance seemed less like a theft and more like a rectification of injustice. Charles, besotted and eager to rectify the losses his beloved daughter had suffered, began to make changes to his will. And this is perhaps the most predatory aspect of the deception. Not that she claimed a false identity, but that she used that false identity to accumulate real power and real wealth. The woman who had spent her life as Margaret Thorne, observing from the margins of society, denied access to the machinery of inheritance and power, was now positioned to transform her material circumstances entirely. And the question that would haunt everyone involved in her case was whether this had been her intention all along, or whether the accumulation of power had simply followed naturally from the cultivation of love. To understand why Charles Ashford allowed himself to be deceived so completely, it is necessary to understand what his life had been like for the 30 years preceding Eleanor's miraculous return. He had not simply lost a daughter. He had lost the entire narrative structure through which he had been organizing his life. Eleanor had died when she was 9 years old. Charles had been a relatively young man then, in his 40s, at the height of his career, possessed of energy and ambition, and the kind of confidence that comes from having been successful in the world. And then suddenly he was a man whose life was divided into before and after. Everything that had happened to him before Eleanor's death was bathed in a particular kind of light. Everything that happened after was overshadowed by her loss. His surviving children, Margaret, Henry, and Robert, had never existed to him as complete entities. They were always in some sense lesser, not because he loved them less as individuals, but because they could not fill the void that Eleanor's death had created. Margaret, in particular, had experienced the strange pain of being compared to a ghost. She had spent her childhood and young adulthood knowing that her father would have preferred her to have been someone else. Not her, but the version of Eleanor that her father had constructed in his mind. This is a particular kind of psychological wound, and Margaret had borne it with the quiet resignation of someone who understands that they are not responsible for their parents' grief. Charles had thrown himself into his work with an almost frantic intensity. He had accumulated wealth that exceeded what any one person could meaningfully use. He had established charitable foundations in Eleanor's name. He had commissioned that marble angel in the cemetery, and he had visited it regularly, maintaining an almost ritualistic relationship with the grave. He had become, to all external appearances, a man entirely devoted to memorializing loss. But what he was actually doing, perhaps without fully understanding it, was maintaining a relationship with a child who no longer existed. Eleanor had become his primary emotional relationship, a relationship that could never surprise him, never disappoint him, never fail to be exactly what he needed it to be. She was a perfect relationship because she only existed in his mind. The psychological literature on prolonged grief identifies a phenomenon in which the bereaved person becomes attached not to the memory of the loved one, but to the grief itself. Grief, in such cases, becomes an identity. It becomes the primary way through which the person understands themselves and their place in the world. Charles Ashford had become a man whose defining characteristic was his loss. The loss of Eleanor had become his most important relationship. And at some level, he had arranged his entire life around maintaining that relationship. When Eleanor walked through his door in March 1921, what Charles encountered was not simply a person claiming to be his daughter. What he encountered was the possibility of recovering the identity he had lost along with Eleanor. He encountered the possibility of becoming, once again, the kind of father who had a daughter. He encountered the possibility of having a relationship that was not mediated by death and time, and the erosion of memory. He encountered, in short, the possibility of transcendence from the psychological prison that grief had constructed around him. And the woman claiming to be Eleanor understood this with extraordinary clarity. She did not need to be Eleanor. She needed to be the possibility of Eleanor. She needed to fill the void in such a way that Charles could recover his pre-Eleanor self, or at least the memory of that self. She needed to allow him to imagine that the last 30 years had been a kind of interruption, a temporary displacement from the life he was actually supposed to be living, and she accomplished this not through deception alone, but through a kind of collusion. She offered Charles a narrative in which his grief was not wasted, in which his pain had served a purpose, in which his beloved daughter had not died, but had simply been hidden away, waiting to be recovered. The loneliness that Charles had experienced for 3 decades was not simply the loneliness of missing a person. It was the loneliness of being a man whose defining relationship was with the dead. He had never been able to move beyond this. His wife, Margaret, Eleanor's mother, had died years ago. He had never remarried. He had thrown himself into his work and his memory of Eleanor, and these two things had filled his life in a way that allowed him to avoid acknowledging the profound emptiness of his emotional existence. When Eleanor returned, Charles was given a reprieve from this loneliness. He was given the possibility of a living relationship with someone he loved absolutely. The fact that this love was built on a foundation of falsehood seems almost beside the point when one considers the psychological necessity that it fulfilled. Charles Ashford needed to stop being alone. Eleanor gave him permission to stop being alone. The fact that she was not really Eleanor becomes, in some sense, irrelevant to the deeper truth of what she provided, the possibility of recovering an identity that had been lost along with his daughter. The records show that in the months following Eleanor's arrival, Charles's behavior changed dramatically. He became more engaged with his surviving children, though still in a hierarchical way in which Eleanor was primary. He began to attend social functions with renewed interest. He seemed lighter, less burdened by the weight of memory. His colleagues noted that he seemed happy for the first time in decades. And this happiness, this genuine transformation, is one of the most troubling aspects of the entire case, because it suggests that the deception, for Charles at least, was not harmful. It was redemptive. It allowed him to recover a part of himself that had been lost. One of the questions that would plague Charles in the period after his deception was discovered was whether the happiness he had experienced during those months had been real. If he had been deceived, could the emotions he felt have been genuine? Could love built on a false foundation be authentic? The answer, of course, is complex. His love for Eleanor, the woman claiming to be Eleanor, was absolutely real. His happiness was absolutely real. The transformation he experienced was absolutely real. But the foundation on which these emotions were built was false. And so the question became, if you have been happy because of a lie, does your happiness become retroactively false? Does it become a kind of contamination, something that can no longer be trusted or valued? Charles struggled with this question for the remainder of his life. He would eventually acknowledge that he had known at some level that Eleanor might not be real, not consciously, not in a way he could articulate to himself or others. But there was a part of him that recognized the probability of deception and chose not to examine it too closely. He had made an active decision to suspend disbelief. because the cost of belief was so much lower than the cost of acknowledging the truth. And in making this decision, he became, in a sense, complicit in his own deception. He was not simply a victim. He was a participant in a conspiracy with the woman claiming to be his daughter, a conspiracy to preserve the beautiful lie that had allowed both of them to recover something essential about themselves. The documents that Eleanor produced, or that appeared in support of Eleanor's claim, followed a careful progression. The first was the letter from Catherine Westmore, the purported English widow. This letter established the narrative of Eleanor's survival and years abroad. The second was a birth certificate, ostensibly recovered from English archives confirming Eleanor's identity. The third was a series of letters, allegedly written by Eleanor to various family members over the years, that she had supposedly been unable to send until she had finally gathered the courage to return home. Each document was more elaborate than the last. Each one seemed to settle some nagging doubt that the family had begun to harbor. What becomes clear upon examination of these documents is that they were not created by someone who was attempting to deceive in the crude sense. They were created by someone who understood the granular details of what authentic documents look like, feel like, read like. The forgeries were not perfect. Indeed, if they had been perfect, they would have raised suspicion. Instead, they contained small, correctable errors that made them seem like genuine historical documents that had been damaged by time and circumstance. There was a small stain on the birth certificate that seemed consistent with water damage. There was a slight irregularity in the handwriting of one of the letters that could be attributed to illness or emotional distress. The forgeries were, in other words, designed to look like the kind of documents that would actually emerge from the archives of time, rather than the kind of documents that come fresh from a forger's desk. What is remarkable about this period, from Eleanor's arrival in March to the beginning of Charles's will revision in May, is how rapidly the emotional reality of her presence overwhelmed the documentary reality of her identity. The documents mattered less and less as time went on. By June, when Charles had begun consulting with his lawyers about revising his will, the documents were almost beside the point. What mattered was the fact that Eleanor was there, present, real in her material form, expressing love for her father, and demonstrating that love through constant attention and emotional attunement. The woman claiming to be Eleanor had understood something crucial about human psychology, that we are far more convinced by presence than by proof. A person who is present, who sees us, who understands us, who responds to us, is almost impossible to disbelieve, regardless of what documentary evidence might suggest. We are creatures of embodied perception, and the presence of another person, combined with our desire to believe in them, is a far more powerful force than abstract questions about authenticity. Eleanor could have presented no documents at all, and if she had been present and emotionally attuned and fulfilling Charles's psychological needs, she would have been believed. But the documents served another function. They provided a kind of plausible deniability. Charles could tell himself that he was not simply choosing to believe. He was choosing to believe in the face of evidence. The documents transformed his decision to suspend disbelief into something that felt more like rational judgment. He was a man who had reviewed the documents and found them convincing. He was not a man who was desperately afraid of returning to his grief, and would therefore accept any narrative that allowed him to escape it. The documents, in other words, allowed Charles to maintain his self-image as a rational person, making rational decisions based on rational evidence. The revision of Charles's will began in earnest in May 1921. His lawyer, a man named Frederick Morrison, had been instructed by Charles to prepare a new draft that would name Eleanor as the primary heir. This was, from a legal standpoint, an unusual decision. Charles had surviving children. They had established claims and expectations. Eleanor's claim, while emotionally powerful, was not legally straightforward. There were no contemporary documents that would have confirmed her identity. There were no witnesses who could verify her story. She was, from a purely legal perspective, a woman claiming to be someone who had been dead for 30 years. But Charles was not operating from a purely legal perspective. He was operating from an emotional one, and he instructed Morrison to find a way to make the revision work. Morrison, presumably, expressed some concern. The records do not show what that concern was, or how Charles responded to it. What is clear is that by June 1921, Morrison had prepared a draft will that named Eleanor as the primary heir, contingent on her identity being verified by the courts. This was a crucial detail. Charles was not simply transferring his wealth to Eleanor. He was transferring it to Eleanor subject to a verification process, and this verification, he seemed to believe, would be straightforward. After all, he was a man of considerable resources. He could hire the best investigators. He could verify Eleanor's identity conclusively, and once he had done so, he could rest assured that his inheritance was going to the person it was supposed to go to. The tragedy, and the point at which the narrative begins its inevitable descent, is that Charles never actually pursued this verification. He had the resources to do so. He could have hired investigators. He could have consulted genealogists. He could have contacted English archives directly. He could have visited the grave that supposedly bore Eleanor's name to see if a body had been interred. He could have done any number of things that would have established whether Eleanor's story was true or false. But he did not. And the reason he did not is perhaps the most illuminating aspect of the entire case. At some level, Charles was afraid of what verification might reveal. If he pursued verification and discovered that Eleanor was not who she claimed to be, then the entire structure of his recovery would collapse. He would return to the grief he had thought he was escaping. He would be left alone again, without the compensation that Eleanor's presence had provided. And so, consciously or unconsciously, he made the decision not to verify. He made the decision to protect the beautiful lie by refusing to examine it too closely. For the woman claiming to be Eleanor, this moment represents a kind of triumph. She had not simply deceived Charles. She had created conditions in which Charles was actively complicit in maintaining the deception. He had become, through the very act of choosing not to verify, a partner in the conspiracy. And with that complicity came a particular kind of vulnerability. As long as Charles was choosing not to look too closely, the deception could be maintained. But the moment his children, particularly Margaret and Robert, began to examine the claim more seriously, the entire structure would be at risk. The accumulation of wealth became central to Eleanor's strategy in this period. She began to encourage Charles to make other financial arrangements on her behalf. She mentioned, casually, that she had suffered financially during her years abroad, that she had been forced to work as a companion to various women, that she had been denied the inheritance that should have been hers. Charles, eager to rectify these injustices, began to transfer funds to her directly. By September, Eleanor had accumulated over $100,000 in liquid assets, a substantial sum at the time, equivalent to roughly $5 million in modern currency. What is striking about this period is that Eleanor does not seem to have been accumulating wealth in order to flee. She was not creating an escape fund. She was accumulating wealth while remaining fully integrated in the household, while strengthening her bonds with Charles, while positioning herself as an increasingly central figure in family life. She was, in other words, creating the material conditions that would allow her to maintain her place indefinitely. She was building a life as Eleanor Ashford, and that life was becoming progressively more real, more substantial, more difficult to relinquish. The victim's experience during this period is crucial to understand. Margaret, Charles's legitimate daughter, was watching her inheritance evaporate. She was watching her father's affection redirected toward this mysterious sister. She was watching financial decisions being made that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of her own life, and she was essentially powerless to stop it, because to challenge Eleanor was to challenge her father's judgment, and to challenge her father's judgment was to risk losing what remained of his affection. Margaret found herself in a psychological prison of her own, unable to speak her suspicions without incurring her father's anger, unable to preserve her inheritance without appearing disloyal to her father's desires. This is the collateral damage that fraud creates. It is not simply the victim who is harmed. It is everyone whose life is entangled with the victims. The family was being broken, slowly and systematically, not by Eleanor's deception alone, but by Charles's active participation in maintaining that deception. And the weight of that inheritance, the weight of being given something that does not belong to you, that has been built on a foundation of lies and broken relationships, would eventually become unbearable for Eleanor herself. The fracture began small, almost imperceptibly in September 1921. It started not with a revelation but with a question, the kind of small, casual question that would ordinarily pass unnoticed, but which, in the context of carefully constructed deception, can become catastrophic. Robert, the youngest of Charles's surviving sons, asked Eleanor to recall a specific detail about her childhood. It was something insignificant, the name of the cat that the family had owned when Eleanor was 7 years old. Eleanor responded with confidence, offering a name and a series of memories associated with that cat. But when Robert checked with his older sister Margaret, he discovered that the cat had actually had a different name. Moreover, Margaret had a photograph of the cat, and it looked distinctly different from the mental image that Eleanor's description had created. This was not proof of anything. It was easy enough for Eleanor to claim that her memory had simply failed, that the shock of her return and the confusion of 30 years might have scrambled some details. But it created a kind of crack in the facade, and more importantly, it activated Robert's investigative instincts. He began to ask more questions. He consulted old family records. He began to construct a genealogy of his own, seeking to verify Eleanor's story independently. What Robert discovered in those autumn months would eventually become the linchpin of the case against Eleanor. He found inconsistencies in the timeline. He found gaps in the documentation. He found instances where Eleanor's story about specific family events did not align with the written records that existed. None of these individual inconsistencies was conclusive on its own, but taken together, they began to form a pattern. And that pattern suggested that Eleanor's knowledge of family history, while extensive, came from research rather than experience. She knew the facts, but she sometimes confused the emotional resonance or the specific details that only a person who had actually lived through the experience would have remembered with perfect clarity. By November 1921, Robert had sufficient doubts that he began to voice them to Henry. Henry, who had been seduced by Eleanor's intellectual sophistication, initially resisted Robert's skepticism, but as Robert shared his findings, Henry began to look at Eleanor with new eyes, and as their skepticism grew, they began to communicate their concerns to their sister Margaret, who had harbored her own doubts from the beginning but had remained silent to protect their father. The question of what to do with their suspicions became agonizing. To confront Eleanor directly might precipitate an irreversible family crisis. To confront their father might result in his refusing to hear them, his doubling down on his belief in Eleanor's authenticity, and yet to remain silent was to allow the deception to continue, to watch their inheritance be systematically transferred to a woman they were increasingly convinced was not who she claimed to be. It was Margaret who made the decision to bring in a professional investigator. She did so secretly, hiring a man named Samuel Price who had worked for the Pinkerton Detective Agency and who had developed considerable expertise in genealogical research and document analysis. She told their father that she was having the family genealogy professionally compiled as a gift for Eleanor's recovery. Charles, pleased with the gesture and completely unsuspicious, paid for the work himself. What Price discovered over the course of 6 weeks was devastating to Eleanor's cause. He traced her back through public records to a woman named Margaret Ellen Thorne, born in Carbondale, Pennsylvania in 1873. He found her birth certificate. He found census records. He found evidence that she had worked as a seamstress and a governess in Wilmington for years, living in various rented rooms and boarding houses. He found records of her paying rent, receiving wages, appearing as a witness on legal documents, and most crucially, he found no evidence, absolutely none, of an Eleanor Ashford born in Delaware in 1882, dying in 1891, or being buried in any cemetery in the state. The grave that Charles had visited so many times, the one with the marble angel, the one that bore Eleanor's name, that grave did not contain the body of an Eleanor Ashford. It contained, according to the church records and the gravedigger who had been working for 30 years, the body of a stillborn infant who had been buried at the request of a charitable organization. No one had ever been buried in that grave except that one small body. Decades before Charles had commissioned the angel, the marble angel had been standing guard over an empty myth, and Charles, over all those years, had been maintaining a relationship not just with a dead daughter but with a daughter who had never lived at all. The grave that bore her name was a grave of his own construction, a monument to his own desperate need to believe in a narrative that had nothing to do with reality. When Samuel Price brought his findings to Margaret in mid-December, Margaret wept, not for the betrayal alone, but for the knowledge of what her father would feel when he learned that the woman he had loved and believed in was not Eleanor. She delayed. She waited to see if there was any possibility that the evidence was wrong, that Price had made some error, but the evidence was overwhelming and meticulously documented. It was Robert who finally decided that they had to tell their father. He drafted a letter that outlined the findings, that presented the evidence, that suggested that Eleanor was not who she claimed to be. But before he could deliver the letter, Eleanor did something extraordinary. She went to Charles and told him herself. Not everything. She did not confess to being Margaret Thorne or to having forged the documents. But she told him enough. She told him that her story was more complicated than she had initially stated. She told him that there were aspects of her past that did not align with the narrative she had given. She offered to undergo the genealogical investigation that Robert was secretly conducting, and she suggested that the family hire independent experts to verify her identity. This moment, the moment in which Eleanor chose to partially reveal the truth, is one of the most psychologically complex in the narrative. Was she attempting to control the narrative before it could be fully exposed? Was she attempting to preserve her position by offering a confession that fell short of the full truth? Or was something else happening? Was she, at some level, exhausted by the performance, ready to relinquish the identity that had been consuming her? What is clear is that her confession created an opening for the full investigation to move forward. Charles, shocked, but not entirely unbelieving, gave permission for the genealogical research to proceed. Within days, Samuel Price's full report was presented to Charles, and on December 27, 1921, Eleanor Ashford ceased to exist. What remained was a woman named Margaret Ellen Thorne, sitting in a study in a mansion that was not hers, listening to a man who was not her father tell her that she had to leave. She had successfully constructed a new identity and maintained it for nearly a year. She had accumulated substantial wealth. She had positioned herself to inherit millions more. But the moment the carefully maintained fiction had been exposed, everything collapsed. The woman who had been so thoroughly Eleanor that the original Margaret had seemed to disappear entirely, found herself once again facing a return to the life she had spent 30 years trying to escape. The unraveling of Eleanor's identity was not a dramatic confrontation, but a slow, painful dissolution. Once Charles understood the truth, or enough of it, he did not rage or demand retribution. Instead, he experienced something closer to catatonia. He retreated into his study. He spent hours sitting in silence, staring at nothing, processing the meaning of what had been done to him. The woman had not simply lied about her identity. She had violated his most sacred relationship, the relationship he maintained with his dead daughter. She had used his grief as a lever to pry open his defenses. She had weaponized his vulnerability. The documents that Eleanor had produced, the forged birth certificate, the false letters from Catherine Westmore, the fabricated evidence of her years abroad, all of these were confiscated. They were placed in a safe. They were evidence now, not of Eleanor's claim, but of her deception. And the remarkable thing about examining these documents in the context of knowing the truth is how convincing they still seem. Even knowing that they are false, there is something almost hypnotic about their plausibility. They did their work well. They convinced Charles Ashford, a man of considerable intelligence and resources. They might have convinced almost anyone. Margaret Thorne, the woman who had briefly been Eleanor Ashford, was given the option to leave quietly. Charles could have prosecuted. The lawyers certainly urged him to do so. But Charles, in a gesture that some would call generous and others would call cowardly, allowed her to simply disappear. She was given enough money to travel to another city, to start over, to construct another life, if that was what she desired. And on a gray day in early January 1922, she left Wilmington. She took a train to Baltimore, carrying a suitcase containing everything she possessed that was not Eleanor's, and the woman named Eleanor Ashford effectively ceased to exist for the second time. What happened to Margaret Thorne after her departure from Wilmington is largely unknown. The historical record offers only fragments. She was reported to have resurfaced in Boston a year later, working again as a seamstress, living in a modest boarding house. She kept to herself. She gave no interviews. She lived quietly, drawing as little attention to herself as possible. The woman who had spent decades constructing an elaborate identity, who had successfully deceived one of the most prominent families in Delaware, who had fundamentally altered the trajectory of her own life through her deception, now seemed to be making the conscious choice to be invisible. This is a kind of tragedy in itself. Margaret had proven that she was capable of extraordinary psychological sophistication. She had demonstrated an ability to understand human psychology, to research, to plan, to execute an elaborate deception over many months. And yet, once that deception was exposed, she seemed to abandon all of these capabilities. She did not attempt to leverage her notoriety. She did not attempt to profit from her story or her fame. She simply retreated into obscurity and seems to have remained there for the remainder of her life. living as the woman she had originally been, denied the transformation that had consumed her attention for so many years. The cost to Charles was immeasurable in ways that are difficult to articulate. He had experienced what psychologists might now recognize as a profound form of betrayal trauma. His grief had been weaponized. His love had been manipulated. The woman he had believed to be his daughter had been a fiction, and his beloved daughter remained as she had been for 30 years, dead. There is a particular kind of pain that comes from having an old wound reopened and then slammed closed again. Charles experienced that pain acutely, but beyond the personal trauma, Charles had to confront something more disturbing about himself. He had to acknowledge that he had known, at some level, that Eleanor was not real. He had had the resources to verify her identity and had chosen not to do so. He had had moments of doubt that he had actively suppressed. He had participated in his own deception because the deception was preferable to the truth. And living with that knowledge, the knowledge that he had allowed himself to be deceived because the lie was more bearable than reality, created a kind of existential crisis. The family relationships were permanently altered. Margaret, who had been displaced by Eleanor's arrival, did not experience the restoration of her father's affection that might be expected after the deception was exposed. Instead, Charles seemed to withdraw from all of his children. He had loved Eleanor, the false Eleanor, with an intensity that his actual children could never match. The revelation that Eleanor was false did not cause him to redirect that love to his legitimate children. Instead, it seemed to create a kind of permanent distrust in his capacity to love, a fear that any love he felt was simply another delusion. Henry, who had been seduced by Eleanor's intellectual sophistication, experienced a particular kind of shame. He had been deceived more completely than anyone except Charles himself, and the woman he had intellectually admired, the woman whose sophistication had impressed him, had turned out to be a fraud. Or rather, her sophistication had been of a particular kind, not the genuine understanding of someone who had lived richly and thought deeply, but the carefully researched knowledge of someone who had studied how to appear educated. Robert experienced a kind of vindication. He had suspected Eleanor from the beginning. He had trusted his instincts. But this vindication came with its own cost. He had been forced to investigate his own sister, or what he believed to be his sister. He had been complicit in exposing a deception that, had it been allowed to continue, would have meant his financial ruin. The moral clarity of his position did not make it any less psychologically exhausting. Margaret, Charles's legitimate daughter, had to live with the knowledge that she had allowed her father to be systematically defrauded. She had known, or suspected, that Eleanor was not real. She had hired the investigator. But she had allowed months to pass in which her father's will was being altered, his wealth was being transferred, his affection was being redirected. She had not acted sooner because she did not want to risk her relationship with her father. And when the truth was finally exposed, she had to confront the way in which her own inaction had been a form of complicity. The costs extended to the legitimate heirs as well. The contested will created legal complications that took months to resolve. Eleanor's gifts and transfers had to be legally reversed, which created a series of financial and legal entanglements. The scandal became public. Newspapers ran stories about the false Eleanor. The family's private shame became a topic of public gossip. The Ashford name, which had been associated with wealth and prestige, became associated with gullibility and fraud. More broadly, the case raised uncomfortable questions about identity, about inheritance, about the nature of family relationships. If Eleanor could deceive them so completely, how reliable were their own perceptions of reality? How well did they actually know each other? How much of family identity is based on genuine knowledge and how much is based on assumption and willingness to believe? These questions hung over the family like a kind of psychological fog, slowly dissipating but never entirely clearing. For the woman who had been Margaret Thorne and briefly Eleanor Ashford, the cost was even more profound. She had constructed an identity that had sustained her for nearly a year. She had experienced for that year a kind of life that she had spent decades imagining. She had been loved. She had been valued. She had been integrated into a family and a social world. And then suddenly all of that had been taken away. She was once again Margaret Thorne, the seamstress's daughter, the woman without a father, the woman who had tried to become someone else and had failed. But beyond the loss of the identity itself, there was the loss of the possibility of transformation. Margaret had believed that it was possible to remake herself, to transcend the circumstances of her birth, to become someone entirely different. The machinery of society had prevented her from doing this legitimately. She had no access to the education or the social positioning that might have allowed her to claim a different identity through conventional means. So she had attempted to claim it through deception, and in being discovered, she had discovered something even more disturbing. That transformation, when it came through deception, was not actually transformation. It was simply a more elaborate form of the same constraints that had imprisoned her in the first place. The psychological aftermath for Eleanor, for Margaret, would have been complex and devastating. She had experienced a genuine sense of becoming Eleanor. The identity had not been a simple performance or a calculated lie. At some level, she had genuinely believed that she was Eleanor Ashford, and the discovery that she was not Eleanor, that the identity she had constructed so carefully was false, that she could not sustain it against scrutiny. This represented a kind of psychological annihilation. The woman she had been, the woman she had tried to become, and the woman she was forced to remain. These three selves were now in irresolvable conflict. What is known is that Margaret Thorne lived quietly and apparently anonymously for at least another decade. Whether she attempted another deception, whether she simply accepted the constraints of her original identity, whether she ever found a way to reconcile the woman she had been, the woman she had briefly become, and the woman she was forced to remain, these questions remain unknown. The historical record offers no further evidence. She disappears from public consciousness in the mid-1920s and does not reappear. And in that disappearance, there is a particular kind of tragedy. The story of a woman who proved that identity itself is constructed, who demonstrated that the barriers between who we are and who we might become are far more permeable than we would like to believe, but who was ultimately crushed by the implications of that discovery. The Delaware case of 1921 has haunted historians and psychologists for over a century because it forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature, about identity, about the fragility of the social structures we depend on to maintain order and meaning in our lives. On one level, it is a simple story. A woman deceived a man and his family in order to gain access to their wealth and social position. It is a crime, a fraud, a violation of trust. But on every deeper level, the story becomes more complex, more troubling, more revelatory about what it means to be human. Consider the question of intention. Did Margaret Thorne set out from the beginning to deceive Charles Ashford? Or did she begin with a fantasy? The fantasy that she could become Eleanor and only gradually move from fantasy to action. The available evidence suggests something between these two poles. She spent decades researching the family. She constructed an elaborate knowledge base. She positioned herself strategically. These are the actions of someone with a plan. But she also seemed genuinely surprised at various moments by her own capacity to sustain the deception. The journals that were later discovered contain passages in which she seems to be marveling at how completely she has become Eleanor, as if she is observing her own transformation from outside of it. This raises a profound question about the nature of deception itself. We typically think of deception as a conscious, intentional act, someone deliberately lying to someone else. But what if deception is something more complex? What if, in some cases, the deceiver is so thoroughly invested in the story they are telling that they cease to be consciously aware that it is a story? What if Eleanor was not a lie that Margaret Thorne was telling, but a truth that Margaret Thorne had become? The question becomes even more complicated when we consider Charles Ashford's role in the deception. Charles was complicit in his own deception. He had the means to verify Eleanor's story. He chose not to. He had the tools to investigate. He deliberately avoided using them. He experienced doubt, and he actively suppressed that doubt. At what point does this kind of complicit surrender become a form of self-deception? At what point does the victim become partially responsible for the deception they experience? The answer, perhaps, is that this distinction between deceiver and deceived is far more permeable than we would like to believe. Both Charles and Margaret were involved in a joint construction of reality. Charles was desperate to believe that Eleanor was real. Margaret was determined to become Eleanor. Their motivations were different, but their actions were complementary. They were, in a sense, collaborating in the creation of a fiction that both of them had a vested interest in maintaining. And perhaps the real tragedy of the case is not that they were engaged in deception, but that they were engaged in a kind of mutual delusion that was destined to eventually collapse. Consider the question of deserving. Margaret Thorne, born to a poor mother in a coal mining town, born without the benefits of education or social position, lived a life that would have been difficult and constrained regardless of her talents or intelligence or capacity for growth. The social structures that governed Delaware in the early 20th century did not provide mechanisms through which a woman of her background could legitimately claim a place in the world that Charles Ashford inhabited. The distance between their lives was not simply a matter of economics. It was a matter of the fundamental structure of society, which was designed to maintain certain people in positions of power and privilege, and to keep others, like Margaret, in positions of servitude and invisibility. When Margaret attempted to overcome this constraint through deception, rather than through legitimate social mobility, she was responding to a reality that was deeply unjust. She was not simply committing fraud. She was responding to the fact that the legitimate pathways to transformation were not available to her. Does this excuse her deception? No, but it contextualizes it. It suggests that her crime was not simply her own individual moral failing, but a response to the structures of inequality and constraint that governed her life. But here is where the psychology becomes even more complicated. Margaret did not succeed in her deception because she was smarter or more cunning than everyone around her. She succeeded because she was offering something that everyone wanted. She was offering Charles the possibility of recovering his lost daughter. She was offering the family the possibility of healing an old wound. She was offering Wilmington society the narrative of a miraculous return, a story of transformation and redemption. In short, she was offering what everyone needed to believe. And we are far more susceptible to deceptions that fulfill our deepest needs than to deceptions that contradict them. This raises a disturbing question about the nature of truth itself. If a deception is so perfectly calibrated to meet the psychological needs of those being deceived that it integrates seamlessly into their understanding of reality, does the deception become, in some sense, true? Charles Ashford had a daughter who was dead. A woman offered to become his daughter. She did not resurrect the dead, but she did provide him with the lived experience of having a daughter, with the emotional reality of a loving relationship, with the possibility of recovery from his grief. In material terms, this was all a fiction, but in psychological terms, this was entirely real. The question becomes, is truth primarily an objective matter, a question of whether a claim corresponds to verifiable facts? Or is truth at some level a subjective matter, a question of whether an experience feels authentic, whether a relationship feels genuine, whether a narrative feels internally coherent and emotionally true? This is not to suggest that all deceptions are acceptable or that truth is purely subjective. It is to suggest that the border between truth and fiction is far more complicated than our legal and ethical systems typically allow for. What makes the case of Eleanor Ashford especially relevant to contemporary psychology is that it reveals something fundamental about identity itself. We tend to think of identity as something fixed, something that emerges from our birth and our biology and our circumstances and remains essentially stable throughout our lives. But the case of Margaret Thorne suggests something far more troubling, that identity is a construction, that it is maintained through constant reaffirmation by others, that it is entirely dependent on social agreement and collective belief. If a woman can research her way into a different identity, if she can convince people that she is someone other than who she was born to be, what does this tell us about the fundamental nature of identity itself? It suggests that the person you are is not simply an inner essence that you carry with you. It is a story that is constantly being written and rewritten through interactions with others. It is something that is maintained through networks of agreement, through documentation, through consistent performance and repetition. Margaret Thorne was able to become Eleanor Ashford because she understood, intuitively, how identity actually works. She understood that being a person is not a private phenomenon. It is a public one. And if you can convince enough people of a particular narrative about who you are, then, in a very real sense, that becomes who you are. The question that this raises for all of us, and perhaps this is why the case continues to resonate, is how much of our own identity is constructed through similar mechanisms? How much of who we are depends on the willingness of others to see us in a particular way? How fragile is the social agreement that maintains our sense of self? We like to believe that our identities are robust, that they are grounded in something more substantial than social agreement. But the case of Eleanor Ashford suggests that this belief might be comforting fiction rather than truth. For Charles Ashford, the question of deserving became central to his understanding of what had happened. Did Margaret Thorne deserve the life she had attempted to claim? Did she deserve to have access to the wealth and privilege and social position that had been denied to her by accident of birth? The question is ethically complex. From one perspective, she attempted fraud and deserves punishment. From another perspective, the social structures that denied her legitimate access to transformation are themselves a form of violence, and her deception is a response to that violence. But perhaps the more important question is what Margaret Thorne's attempt reveals about the relationship between identity and entitlement. Margaret believed that she deserved to be Eleanor Ashford. She believed that the life she had been assigned, poor, invisible, constrained, was not a fitting reflection of her capacities or her worth. She believed that a different life was possible, and more importantly, that she deserved it. Her deception was not simply a crime. It was an assertion of a belief about the contingency of identity and the possibility of transformation. And in this, she was both tragically right and tragically wrong. She was right that identity is constructed, that transformation is possible, that the life we have been assigned is not necessarily the life we deserve. But she was wrong in believing that this transformation could be achieved through deception, because deception does not actually transform you. It simply builds a more elaborate prison. It constrains you in new ways, makes you dependent on the maintenance of a fiction, and ultimately ensures that when the fiction collapses, and it always collapses, you are left without even the identity you started with. The lesson of Eleanor Ashford, if there is one, is not that deception is wrong, though it is. It is that transformation is possible, but only through means that do not require you to abandon yourself entirely. The woman who called herself Eleanor Ashford was attempting to become someone other than herself. In doing so, she lost herself. She could not be both Margaret Thorne and Eleanor Ashford. She could only be one or the other. And in choosing to become Eleanor, she unmade herself entirely. What if Margaret Thorne had attempted a different kind of transformation? What if she had devoted the same intelligence, the same research capacity, the same psychological sophistication to understanding how a woman of her background might legitimately claim a different life? What if she had used her talents not to deceive, but to educate, not to manipulate, but to advocate, not to construct a false identity, but to build on the identity she had and make it something greater? We will never know. History only tells us what actually happened, not what might have been possible. But in considering what might have been possible, perhaps we are confronted with the deepest question the case raises. How do we, as a society, structure ourselves so that transformation is possible? How do we create social systems in which people are not forced to choose between remaining imprisoned in a predetermined identity and constructing an elaborate fiction to escape that imprisonment? How do we acknowledge the contingency of identity without abandoning the possibility of truth? How do we allow for the fluidity of self while maintaining the ethical grounds for holding people accountable for the deceptions they perpetrate? These questions have no simple answers. They are the questions that Eleanor Ashford or Margaret Thorne or whoever that woman actually was left us with, and they remain, over a century later, deeply relevant. Because we are all, in a sense, engaged in the same process that Margaret was engaged in. We are all constructing identities, performing selves, seeking to be seen and recognized by others in particular ways. We are all, perhaps, engaged in deceptions of varying degrees of elaboration, and we are all dependent to some extent on the willingness of others to see us as we wish to be seen rather than as we are. The tragedy is not simply that Margaret deceived Charles. The tragedy is that she felt the need to deceive him at all. The tragedy is that a woman of intelligence and capacity felt that the only way to claim a life worth living was to become someone other than herself. And the deepest tragedy is that she was probably right. Given the social structures of 1921 Delaware, given the constraints placed on women without family position or wealth, given the mechanisms through which identity was established and validated, she probably could not have claimed that life through legitimate means. She probably did have to become someone else. And that, perhaps more than any particular crime or deception, is what the case of Eleanor Ashford reveals about the gap between who we are and who we pretend to be, and why we are all, in some sense, vulnerable to deception. Because we are all pretending all the time. We are all constructing the versions of ourselves that we present to the world, and we are all dependent on the consent of others to maintain those constructions. Eleanor Ashford simply made visible something that is usually invisible. She simply revealed through her deception the deceptive nature of identity itself. And in doing so, she challenged not just Charles Ashford but all of us to examine how much of our own identity is constructed, how much depends on the willingness of others to believe in us, and what we might become if we had the courage or the desperation to reconstruct ourselves entirely.